Welcome to this part 2 of this quest. In this part, we're going more into the application of how you can manage your mind using the neurocycle. One of the things you've heard me say a few times, and you'll hear me say this many times, is that you cannot change your story. You can't change what's happened to you. That's the past. But you can change what it looks like inside of you and how it plays out into your future. It's not helpful to think of depression and anxiety as brain diseases, because that implies that you're stuck with a brain disease. It's also not even evidence-based. So, in other words, that means it's not scientific to say that mental health is a brain disease or a mental illness. It's more helpful, hopeful, and scientific to think of it as the responses that we have, like anxiety and depression, as one of the signals. It's more helpful to think of those as being a normal response to adverse circumstances and events. Actually, the reason that we're battling is life experiences. So the cause is not in the brain. The cause is in our life experiences, and the impact is in the brain. This is because the mind uses the brain in that life is processed through the brain by the mind. And it's also processed through the body by the mind. So we see the impact of life in our brain and our body, not the cause in our brain and our body. Unless, of course, one has a traumatic brain injury where there's actual physical damage to the brain, or there's some kind of tumor or something in the brain, or some kind of medication for maybe cancer treatment which is affecting the brain, then we can say there is that element as well, which can contribute for sure to having mental health issues. But in general, when we're battling as humans, we are battling from us as a unique human being with our unique individual stories in the context of our life. So the cause is in that relationship, your stories of the impact of life on you versus you having a broken brain. In fact, scientific evidence does not support the current biomedical model. The current biomedical model says the following about mental illness. It says mental illness is a localized, disordered neural circuit. So that means that they're saying that there's some circuit inside the brain that is faulty. So therefore, if you're sad or depressed or anxious, it's because you've got this faulty circuit, regardless of what you're going through. I mean, there's a logic problem here. If you just think about it, that doesn't make sense. The other pillar is that it's a brain disease, that you've actually got a disease of the brain. So if you're anxious or depressed or feeling up and down in your moods or having hearing sounds or delusions, that's because you have a brain disease. Your brain is diseased, and therefore that's causing it. But actually, what about maybe the fact that you were abused or have been in a terrible marriage or have been bullied or have lost loved ones or live in extreme racist environments or whatever? Those are environmental circumstances that are affecting your story and therefore affecting how you're functioning. And yes, those experiences pass through the mind into the brain, and because they're toxic, they will damage the brain. But the cause is not in the brain, the result is in the brain. We're also told that in this model that depression can be predicted by genes, that it's genetic, that it passes down through the family. And this has been done on a lot of research on twin studies. And it has not been able to be replicated, and it has been disproved. So there isn't solid scientific evidence that mental illness is genetic. What happens is an epigenetic factor. Epi means over and above the genes. So whatever nurturing you have is going to go into your brain as a neural network, as I've been telling you. Now that passes, anything unmanaged, anything inside of you passes through the sperm and the ova to the next generation as little like sealed up epigenetic factor. So it's something that's like sealed up and it's on top of the genes. And that is activated or not activated. How is it activated? Through your environment. So if you have parents that are battling with depression and you're growing up with a parent who is very anxious and worried, and that's your nurturing, then that activates that epigenome. And then that can manifest in your life. So that's why we see patterns of depression going through family. Because of the environment, the nurturing that activates the potential. So there's a potential that's passed down through the generations, but it's not genetic. It's a potential epigenome that can be activated. I know it's quite complex to understand, but it's called the genetic liability that is in place. But that doesn't mean that you are going to get depression. There's a chance that it could be activated, but it doesn't mean that that's a life sentence. It doesn't mean that that's all who you are and that you can't ever overcome that. What it means is that the potential was there, that epigenome was there, but the great news is that with your mind, you can actually change that epigenetic factor and then rewire the brain so that it doesn't have to be something that you live with and that your generations following you live with. But that's not spoken about enough, although there is a vast amount of scientific evidence supporting that. It cannot actually be predicted from our genes. And then the last pillar is the chemical imbalance theory, which is 85 to 90% of people globally have been told about these 4 pillars, but probably the most popular is the chemical imbalance theory, which is considered a myth by scientists, and it has never been proven. And in fact, in the psychiatric textbooks right from the 90s, it's in the psychiatric textbooks that depression is not from a chemical imbalance. And for 56 years, people have been researching this to show that this is not the case. Most people, 85 to 90% of the global population, believe that their depression is coming from a chemical imbalance. So what those 4 pillars have done is they've excluded your story, they've excluded your environment, they've excluded the context of racism, socioeconomic issues, political issues, war, crime, poverty, abuse, trauma. And they basically said, well, those are there, but they're not really the cause of mental illness. There's something wrong with you as an individual. And the research shows that that takes hope away from a person. If you think, well, this is who I am, what hope is there? Whereas the truth is that your brain is neuroplastic. The truth is that you can't change what's happened, but you can change what it looks like inside of you and how it plays out into your future. The biomedical model, as I've said, doesn't have good evidence at all. This was recently confirmed again by 3 very big, comprehensive 2022 research reviews by some of the top neuroscientists in the world. And I put the link there for you to read the studies, summaries of the studies. Research coming out of Yale University and recently as well indicates actually that we have no normal brain. All of us are so unique that there is no one normal version of a brain, that each of us have our own unique mind, and our mind is driving our uniqueness in how our brain functions. So if we come from the fact that each of us is unique and that our life circumstances impact brain function, and that will then influence how we show up, and then let's help a person manage how they show up and help them to get to a place of strength where they can then hopefully get help to change their circumstances and their environment. That's a much more humane, healthy way of managing mental health. Chronic unmanaged stress leads to mental and physical challenges. And the reason is that in every second you are making 800,000 to 1 million new cells. That process of making new cells is controlled by the DNA. In the DNA, you get your chromosomes, and chromosomes basically got telomeres. Telomeres are the ends of chromosomes. So in simple scientific way of explaining this, our telomeres need to be healthy in order for us to make healthy cells. If I'm not managing my mind, my telomeres immediately get affected. And if you're under constant chronic stress, those telomeres get even more affected, which affects your cells, which affects your physical health. And so therefore our mind is changing the way our body is functioning. So therefore you will have increased inflammation. You will have upset neurochemicals. There isn't a specific pattern because it's unique for each person. You will have changes in brain structure because of neuroplasticity. And that's what I have been said in lesson 1, the mind-brain-body connection. How we're using our mind and how our mind moves through the brain and the body will result in changes to the physical structure. But that's the impact, not the cause. And the reason why it's so important to distinguish is then the way that you treat it. If you think that mental illness is a biological thing or a neurobiological cause, then you're going to want to treat it like something like diabetes or like heart disease, where they can use very specific tests to identify very specific symptoms, and they can make a diagnosis. Diagnosis implies that you can take the symptoms and track the symptoms to an underlying biological cause, like heart disease is in the heart, or diabetes, there's a problem with insulin in the pancreas, very specific. Then you have treatments that will target the insulin target the heart disease, whether it's medications or surgery or various other interventions. That works beautifully for the physical brain and body, but it doesn't work for the mind. The biomedical model has tried to mix that into the mind. They've taken on this diagnostic approach of saying, if you have X symptom, anxiety, depression, delusions, hearing voices, psychotic breaks, whatever the symptoms are, for a certain amount of time. In the DSM, they've created these symptom checklists, which are not at all scientific, nor they've been able to replicate them, nor they've been able to validate them, but they're used as though they are accurate science. They take those lists, and there's questionnaires that are asked, and based the assumption, and let me stress the word assumption, is that there is a neurobiological, genetic, chemical imbalance underlying cause. But unfortunately, that isn't the case with the mind, because the science doesn't show that. They have spent 56 years, hundreds of millions of billions of dollars and euros trying to show that there's a neurobiological, chemical imbalance, genetic, neurocircuitry disruption, but they haven't to this day been able to confirm that evidence. Yet people, 85 to 90% of the population, think that they are sad or depressed because of something wrong with them. So this is really good news. This is fantastic news, because this means that if you are sad or anxious or depressed or whatever extreme, and obviously extreme trauma will result in extreme responses. So if you have years of trauma, you're going to have maybe massive bouts of depression that are incapacitating, versus if the trauma is maybe shorter, not as intense, maybe the depression or anxiety won't be as much. The fact of the matter is, it's the environmental situation and your story within that's causing the problem, that's changing the brain, etc. So yes, we do need medicine to be able to deal with the impact of life crises. So thank goodness for the basics of medicine treating the physical part of us, but we can't use that to treat the mind issue. And the mind's driving the brain and the body, and the mind is 90 to 99% of who you are. The brain and the body physically are 1 to 10% of who you are. So we have to address the 1 to 10% in one way, the 90 to 99% of the mind in the other way, and we have to put the two together to be able to offer people support as they go through life. And so drug companies and the psychiatric system are kind of reducing the complexities of the endless nuances of our stories to a label with a biological solution. It's invalidating what people are going through. You don't need a label or a medical label or a medical diagnosis to validate your pain. Every story of your life is valid. You need to be honored with that. You need to be heard and process through it, be able to get into a safe space and have the tools in place where you can understand how to process and what to do with what you've processed and how to move forward in your life. So we need mind management. We don't need another diagnosis. It hasn't worked. It hasn't been working. And in fact, research shows from 1996 to 2014, a massive study was done. Federal data was released on the study. And it showed that between 1996 and 2014, that people are actually dying 8 to 25 years younger than they should from preventable lifestyle issues. And those preventable lifestyle issues that people are dying younger from, 8 to 25 years younger from, are coming from how people are actually managing their life. So we need to be able to embrace and process and reconceptualize what we have gone through as an individual. As I said, we can't change our story, but we can change what it looks like inside of us. When you're able to change what things look like inside of you, in other words, when you've been given mind management, you are much more able to be able to know what you need to be able to move forward in your life. But it starts with you being able to live in a space where you can actually safely live in your own headspace, to be able to then determine what can you do with your environment. And this is the tool that I've tried to provide with the Neurocycle. The slide that you're seeing on the screen now is from my clinical trials, my recent clinical trials. And all you need to look at are the last 2 rows. And if you look at the top last 2 rows, you'll see a lot of blue. And if you look at the bottom screen, you'll see more turquoise and oranges and yellows and different colors. What I'm looking at specifically in those particular rows are what we call the gamma brainwave. And the gamma brainwave is very active in neuroplasticity. So when we see certain patterns in the gamma activity, we know that rewiring is taking place. So without mind management, people stay stuck. And that's what the blue brain shows. When people are actually managing their mind, even if they're battling still, but they're doing something, they're progressing forward, they're learning, they're going through the neurocycle, then we'll see lots of color in the brain. What we found was that those in the control group where the chronic stress was not being managed and it just kept getting worse and worse, their homocysteine levels increased. Now, increases in homocysteine indicate that there's an increase in inflammation in the brain and the body. And where there's increased inflammation, there's potential for disease. Once they managed it, those in the experimental group, their homocysteine levels normalized. So the opposite happened. Once we gave the control group the neurocycle treatment, their homocysteine also normalized. We saw the same pattern with cortisol. The chronic unmanaged stress, the cortisol went completely out of whack. And once they were managing it, then the cortisol normalized. What you're seeing on the screen are the telomeres I spoke about earlier on. Your telomeres are the ends of chromosomes, and chromosomes unwind into your DNA where your genetic code is. So the little gold ends that you're seeing on the screen, those are your telomeres. And what we want is for them to be long and strong, because when your cells replicate and you make new cells, then every time they replicate, those telomeres are involved in that process. And if they get short and weak, then we don't have healthy cells, we don't have healthy bodies. That affects everything. So what the research shows is that telomeres are how long and strong they are directly correlated with how we're managing our minds, how we're managing our mental health. So there's been a lot of work done on diet and exercise and that kind of thing and how they influence telomeres, but the more powerful indicator is your mind. So what we found in our research is that as people were going through the neurocycle over 63 days, they started with very short, weak telomeres, and over the cycle of 63 days, they increased their telomere length. We found some quite dramatic changes in my most recent clinical trials, and in one of the case studies, which is in this book, Cleaning Up Your Mental Mess, their telomeres at day 1 or baseline of the study were basically showing that they had a biological age that was up to 35 years older than the actual chronological age. So telomeres tell us a lot about the age of our actual body versus our chronological age. And obviously you want it to match. You want your biological and chronological age to match, but even more ideally, you want your biological age to be younger than your chronological age. And basically what we found is that through the neurocycle, in this particular case that you're looking at on the screen at the moment, this particular subject, their biological age was up to 35 years older than their chronological age. Within 9 weeks, they gained 35 years of biological health just through mind management. So the evidence is more, we are replicating this study, we're doing more research in this area, but there's a lot of research out there now showing that our mind directly impacts how we function. So what I'd love you to do over this week is I've given you a lot of information. Rewatch this quest a few times and just process it, and then just write down in your journal that you've been making that you've been doing the exercises that I've already asked you to do. Just journal down how you understood mental health and how you see it differently now and how that would apply in your life. What difference does that make in your life right now? And how does that make you feel? Now, good news is that coming up in the next 2 lessons, I am going to teach you the neurocycle. And that's the mind management system that I was using for these subjects that I was describing in my clinical trial, where they gained 35 years of biological health and the homocysteine and cortisol and those things stabilized and normalized, and where they felt so much more in control. I'm going to be teaching you that system called the neurocycle in the next 2 lessons.